I have been obsessed with the idea of scale in the last 2 or 3 years, and that is how I worked on a book called The Elephant Catchers, arguing in that book that people in villages who go on a hunt and people who catch rabbits are not the people who can catch elephants. Catching an elephant requires a very different mindset. We require the spirit of the elephant catchers and not just the enthusiasm of the rabbit catchers today to be able to take India and the world along with India into the next level of affluence and excellence. In doing that, there are 6 things that the entrepreneurs in the audience I would request you to take note of. So if we look at technology organizations that have scaled, if we look at non-technology organizations that have scaled, if we look at state governments that have scaled and national governments that have scaled, we find that there are 6 major things that people who scale do right. First and foremost, people who scale must have comfort with the idea of scale. This is not an easy to achieve thing. If we don't have comfort with the idea of scale, we just cannot scale. So somebody has to have a hairy, audacious goal. The need to build fabrication capability in India, in a country with our kind of challenges, is nothing short of a hairy, audacious goal. So similarly, if we look at the life of an entrepreneur, we have to think about a fabrication unit where we cannot even afford to take care of the next quarter's revenues. People who scale are extremely comfortable with the idea, and that is how they go on building scale. The second important thing that we have to keep in mind is that in building scale, we have to continuously think about changing 1 or more of 3 things every 5 years. What are those 1 or more of 3 things? Every 5 years, there must be a perceptible change in terms of what is the product or service. There must be a perceptible change in terms of who's the customer. And there must be a perceptible change in terms of the way that that product or service is delivered. If the customer, the product or service, and the methodology in which it is getting delivered looks familiar, then the organization is not scaling. Now, this is counterintuitive because as entrepreneurs, particularly startup entrepreneurs, we are told to be focused on the product or service, to be in love with the customer. Nothing can be further from the truth. While that is true, at every inflection point, entrepreneurs will have to think about what is the next product, what is the next service, and who is likely to be the next customer who will be able to take me in an orbit-raising maneuver. The third important point is that even before we scale our organizations, we have to scale the intellect. Business, entrepreneurship, nation building, all these are mind games. If it happens in the mind, it will happen outside of the mind. We build the world around us as an image of our own mind. So we need to scale our intellect. We must be able to mentally create a vision of the future that doesn't exist so that other people can live in that future. The next important thing is organizations that scale their reputation. They pay conscious attention to scaling reputation. Scaling reputation is interesting in today's world because reputation is a new form of capital. There was a time when we used to talk about money as capital. There was a time when we used to talk about machinery as capital. There was a time when we would talk about human resources capital. But in today's world, reputation is the new capital. We settle dues with reputation. When we make an organization scale, it is very, very unlikely that we'll be able to do that without making mistakes. And sometimes those mistakes are in public eye. When 2 companies make a mistake, make a similar mistake, one company is forgiven and the other company, everybody jumps on the case off. The difference between the first and the second usually is who has pre-invested in building reputation. The fifth important thing is that organizations that scale must scale their own people. And this may sound like motherhood and apple pie, but the interesting thing is in a startup, the entrepreneur is the best guy. Entrepreneur is the most capable guy. And the entrepreneur is obsessively focused on building the business and building himself or herself. And without realizing, is continuously competing with his own people or with her own people. So when the big negotiation comes, who's negotiating? It is the entrepreneur who's negotiating. When the big thinking through is happening, who's doing the thinking? It is the entrepreneur who is doing it. When the great presentation is to be made, when a very important client comes visiting, it is the entrepreneur who is doing it. And while that is happening, it is happening at the cost of the people who will be critical to scaling the organization. As entrepreneurs, our job is not to be the best. Our job is to employ the best people. So it's very critical for us to understand when we need to step back and when we need to stop competing with our own people. Last but not the least, people who scale are people who are able to scale adversity. It is not technical excellence, it is not managerial capability, but if we look at organizations that have been around for 25 years and 50 years and 100 years, we'll find that these people knew how to hang in there when everything else seemed to fall apart. So when we look at the House of Tatas, when we look at an organization like Intel or Microsoft, or we look at the TVS group, these are not necessarily all the time the most brilliant organizations, but they're very solid organizations. They know when to raise their head and when not to raise their head. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a privilege to be here today, but in summary, I will once again sincerely request that across political affiliations, across political ideologies, we need to pull India, and along with India, the continent of Africa, from the darkness of the world map, which shows that we remain technologically landlocked and we cannot make quantum progress without bringing in a fab into India at the soonest. Thank you very much, and welcome to the two-day summit.
Thank you, sir, for a highly insightful and, in fact, thought-provoking theme address. Before we leave Mr. Bagchi, I would request Mr. Sanjeev Keskar, the chairman of IESA, to kindly come over and give a memento to. Ladies and gentlemen, it was indeed an ideal start for the Vision Summit 2014.